Welcome back. You are listening to the home of forbidden romances. Prepare yourself, because tonight's story will leave you breathless. The barrel of the shotgun was cold, rusted, and pressed firmly against the center of Julian's forehead, a stark contrast to the Italian silk suit that was currently being ruined by the relentless, freezing downpour. "Give me one reason why I shouldn't pull this trigger and leave your carcass for the hogs," the voice growled, low and jagged like gravel in a blender. Julian Vane, former CFO of Vane Enterprises and until 3 hours ago the most eligible bachelor in Manhattan, didn't tremble. He couldn't. The shock was too absolute. He stood in the mud, clutching a Louis Vuitton briefcase that contained the shredded remains of his life, staring down the barrel held by a man who looked more like a bear than a human being. The flashing lights of the taxi that had dumped him here, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rotting cornfields and encroaching forestry, had long since faded into the gloom. Julian had been framed for embezzlement he didn't commit, stripped of his frozen assets, and exiled to the only property the government hadn't seized, a derelict, forgotten estate in the ass end of the countryside. And his welcome committee was a hulking, scarred brute with murder in his eyes. "Because," Julian said, his voice struggling to maintain the icy arrogance that had terrified boardrooms for a decade, "I own the deed to this mud pit, and technically, that makes me your landlord." The man narrowed his eyes. They were dark, storm gray, and devoid of fear. He lowered the shotgun slowly, spitting a stream of tobacco juice dangerously close to Julian's terrifyingly expensive Oxfords. "Landlord?" The man scoffed, turning his back and walking toward a dilapidated cabin that looked like a stiff breeze would flatten it. "You won't last a week, city boy. The soil here eats soft things alive." The estate was called Blackwood, though Wasteland would have been more appropriate. Julian's grandmother, a woman he had never met, had left it to him in a will drafted 30 years ago. It was a sprawling, dying acreage of overgrown timber and rocky soil. The main house was a Victorian monstrosity with a leaking roof, no Wi-Fi, and a heating system that groaned like a dying animal. And then there was Silas Thorne, the man with the shotgun, the squatter, the caretaker. Julian spent the first 3 days in a state of manic denial. He paced the dusty floorboards of the master bedroom, wearing his suit because he refused to unpack his casual wear. It felt like admitting defeat. He spent hours shouting into his phone, trying to get a signal to call his lawyers, demanding to know when his accounts would be unfrozen. Silence was his only answer. By the 4th day, the hunger set in. The pantry was empty save for dust and mouse droppings. Julian, proud, arrogant Julian, had to descend from his ivory tower, or rather, the 2nd floor, and find the brute. He found Silas in the barn, shirtless, splitting wood with an axe. The sight made Julian pause in the doorway. It was a visceral, violent display of power. Silas was a landscape of scars. Burn marks twisted up his left arm. A jagged white line ran from his collarbone to his navel. Muscles coiled and snapped under sweat-slicked skin with every swing of the axe. It was raw, masculine aggression channeled into labor. Julian cleared his throat. "I require food." Silas didn't stop swinging. Thwack. The log split cleanly. "Store's 10 miles that way. Walking shoes better be good." "I have no vehicle." "The taxi left," Julian snapped. "And I have no cash. You know this." Silas finally stopped. He rested the axe head on the dirt, leaning on the handle, wiping sweat from his brow with a rag. He looked Julian up and down, taking in the wrinkled suit, the dark circles under the eyes, the trembling hands. "There's stew on the stove in the cabin," Silas grunted. "Don't expect room service." It was the beginning of a humiliating, necessary truce. Julian ate the stew, venison, he assumed, though he didn't ask, with a voraciousness that shamed him. Silas watched him from the shadows of the small cabin, silent, judging. "Why are you here?" Julian asked, wiping his mouth with a napkin he'd brought from the main house. "A man like you, capable, you could find work elsewhere. Why rot in this place?" Silas's expression darkened. He touched the jagged scar on his neck. World doesn't have much use for broken tools, Vane. I stay where I'm left alone. Until you showed up. I intend to leave as soon as I clear my name, Julian assured him. Good, Silas said. Because winter's coming. And you're too pretty to survive the freeze. The insult stung, mostly because Julian feared it was true. But as the weeks bled into a month, the reality of his situation cemented. The legal battle in the city was stalled. His half-brother, Adrian, the snake who had framed him, was liquidating Vane Enterprises. Julian was trapped. If he was going to stay, he couldn't live in squalor. He was Julian Vane. He built empires. If all he had was dirt, he would build an empire of dirt. We need to fix the roof, Julian announced one morning, finding Silas mending a fence. Silas didn't look up. I am not paying you, mostly because I cannot, but I am offering you a partnership. You provide the labor and the knowledge of this godforsaken wilderness. I provide the strategy and the management. Silas snorted. Management? You don't know a hammer from a horseshoe. Teach me. The words hung in the crisp autumn air. Silas stopped working, turning to look at Julian. The city boy had shed the suit jacket. He was wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing pale, unblemished forearms. He looked ridiculous, but his eyes were sharp, desperate, and burning with a will to survive. You'll get blisters, Silas warned. I don't care. You'll bleed. I've bled before, Julian lied. He hadn't. Not like this. Fine, Silas grunted. Grab the other end of this post. Don't drop it on your toes, princess. The work was hell. It was agony. Julian's hands, used to signing checks and typing on glass, were shredded within hours. His back screamed. His pride took a beating every time he failed to lift something or didn't know the name of a tool. But Silas, surprisingly, wasn't cruel. He was stern, exacting, and silent. But when Julian stumbled, a calloused hand would shoot out to steady him. There was a strange intimacy in the labor, the transfer of sweat, the shared groans of exertion, the proximity. Julian began to see Silas not just as a brute, but as a masterpiece of survival. He watched the way Silas moved, the efficient economy of his strength. He noticed the way Silas would gently move a spider out of the way before hammering a board, a contrast to his violent appearance. One evening, after they had successfully patched a section of the barn roof, they sat on the ridge, looking out over the overgrown fields as the sun set. A bottle of cheap whiskey, Silas's stash, sat between them. This land, Julian said, his voice raspy from dust. It's useless for crops. The soil is too rocky. Why did my grandmother keep it? Not crops, Silas said, taking a swig. Water. There's a spring deep in the woods. Purest water in the state. And the wild juniper berries. They grow like weeds here. Julian's mind, always the calculator, always the shark, clicked into gear. Juniper. And pure water. He looked at Silas. Gin. Silas blinked. What? We don't farm corn, Silas. We make high-end, artisanal gin. Small batch. Blackwood Reserve. The narrative sells itself. From the forgotten heart of the wilderness. Julian's hands framed the air, excitement flushing his cheeks. I know the distributors in the city. I know the branding. If we can make it, I can sell it for a fortune. Silas looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without disdain. He saw the fire. I know how to distill, Silas admitted quietly. My old man. He was a moonshiner. Before he went to prison. Then we have a business plan, Julian said, reaching for the bottle. Their fingers brushed. The contact was electric. A spark that jumped from Silas's rough skin to Julian's smooth palm. Neither pulled away immediately. You're crazy? Silas murmured, his voice dropping an octave. I'm desperate, Julian corrected, his gaze dropping to Silas's lips. And I'm tired of losing. The slow burn ignited 3 weeks later during a storm. The power went out in the main house, and the temperature plummeted. Julian, freezing in his majestic but drafty bedroom, migrated to the living room fireplace. Silas was there, feeding logs into the hearth. Julian was shivering, his teeth chattering. Silas watched him for a moment, then stood up and grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the sofa. He wrapped it around Julian, his movements rough but careful. "You're turning blue," Silas muttered. "I hate this place," Julian whispered, though the venom was gone from his voice. "I hate the cold." "Then come here." It wasn't a request. Silas sat on the rug before the fire and pulled Julian down with him. He wrapped his massive arms around Julian's slender frame, encompassing him. Julian stiffened for a second, the ingrained haughtiness flaring up, but then the heat of Silas's body seeped through his shirt. It was overwhelming. Silas smelled of wood smoke, rain, and musk. It was the most intoxicating scent Julian had ever encountered. "Better?" Silas asked, his breath hot against Julian's ear. "Yes," Julian breathed. He turned in Silas's embrace. The firelight danced across Silas's scars, making them look like rivers of gold. Julian reached out, tracing the line of the scar on Silas's neck. Silas flinched. "Don't," Silas rasped. "I'm ugly, vain. Don't pretend I'm not." "You're not ugly," Julian said, his voice firm. "You're broken. Like the house. Like me." "You ain't broken," Silas countered. "You're just bent. I can fix bent." "Then fix me." Silas kissed him. It wasn't tentative. It was acclaiming. It was hungry and desperate, tasting of whiskey and repressed longing. Silas's hands, so large they could crush Julian's skull, were reverent as they tangled in Julian's hair. Julian melted, surrendering control for the first time in his life. He realized, with a jolt of terror and ecstasy, that he didn't want to be the CEO here. He wanted to be held. That night, on the rug in front of the dying fire, the boundaries between landlord and squatter, prince and pauper, dissolved. There was only the friction of skin, the gasp of breath, and the forging of a bond stronger than steel. Winter was brutal, but they worked through it. The distillery was set up in the barn. Julian used a burner phone to contact old associates, calling in favors, threatening exposures, doing whatever it took to get bottles and labels. Silas worked the still, a master of chemistry and intuition. The first batch of Blackwood Reserve was ready by spring. It was smooth, complex, with a bite of wild juniper and a finish of pine. Tasted like the land. Tasted like them. But just as the first shipment was packed, the black SUVs rolled up the driveway. Julian was labeling bottles when the door burst open. Adrian Vane walked in, flanked by 2 private security contractors and a lawyer. Well, Adrian sneered, looking around the barn. "I heard you were playing farmer, Jules. Didn't think you were actually getting your hands dirty." Julian stood up, wiping glue from his hands. "Get off my property, Adrian." "Not your property for long," the lawyer interjected, holding up a file. "The asset seizure has been expanded. The state is auctioning Blackwood to cover your debts. And guess who the buyer is?" Adrian smirked. "I'm going to bulldoze this heap. Put up a hunting lodge. Maybe I'll keep your pet," he gestured to Silas, who had just entered from the back. "To clean the toilets." Silas went still. It was the stillness of a predator before the strike. He reached for a heavy iron wrench on the workbench. His eyes had gone dead, the eyes of the man who had met Julian with a shotgun. "Silas, no!" Julian shouted. Silas lunged. The security guards moved to intercept, tasers drawn. "Stop!" Julian's voice cracked like a whip. "Silas, stand down." Silas froze, his chest heaving, the wrench raised. He looked at Julian, confusion and rage warring in his gaze. "He'll kill you," Silas growled. "Or I'll kill him. Let me finish it." "No," Julian said, stepping between the hulking man and the intruders. He turned to Adrian, his face transforming. The fear was gone. The rustic softness was gone. The shark of Wall Street was back. "You missed something, Adrian," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. You were so busy fabricating the embezzlement charges that you didn't check the incorporation dates of the grandmother's trust. Adrian frowned. What are you talking about? Blackwood isn't just land, Julian said, stepping forward. It's a historical charter. And according to state law, any agricultural business produced on historical charter land that generates revenue within the fiscal year grants the owner immunity from asset forfeiture until a federal audit is complete. It buys me 2 years. Julian picked up a bottle of the gin. We sold our first case online this morning. The transaction is recorded. He smiled, and it was a smile full of teeth. This is a functioning business, brother. And you are trespassing on commercial property. If you don't leave in the next 30 seconds, Silas here is going to escort you out. And as you can see, he has some anger management issues. Silas hefted the wrench, a dark grin spreading across his face. 20 seconds. Adrian turned pale. He looked from the legal papers to the hulking, scarred man who looked ready to tear him limb from limb. This isn't over, Adrian spat, turning on his heel. Oh, I know, Julian called after him. I'm coming for the company next. Keep the seat warm for me. When the SUVs sped away, Julian collapsed against the workbench, his legs giving out. Silas caught him before he hit the floor. Did you make that up? Silas asked, holding him tight. About the charter? Yes, completely. Julian laughed breathlessly. But it bought us time. My lawyers will use the confusion to file a real injunction. We won, Silas. For today. Silas looked down at him, awe in his eyes. You crazy son of a bitch. You lied to the devil's face. I told you. Julian smoothed the hair back from Silas's forehead. I build empires, and we are going to build this one. Together. 2 years later. The penthouse overlooking Central Park was a far cry from the drafty cabin at Blackwood. It was sleek, modern, and screamed wealth. But in the center of the living room, in a place of honor, hung an old, rusted shotgun mounted on the wall. Julian adjusted his tie in the mirror. He was CEO of Vane Enterprises again, having cleared his name and exposed Adrian's fraud. But Vane Enterprises was different now. It had a subsidiary, Blackwood Distilling, the most exclusive spirit brand in the country. Strong arms wrapped around his waist from behind. Silas rested his chin on Julian's shoulder. Silas was wearing a suit, custom-tailored to fit his massive frame, but he still refused to wear a tie. The scars were still there, but the haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. Cars waiting, Silas rumbled. Gala starts in 20 minutes. Let them wait, Julian said, leaning back into the warmth of his partner. They can't start without the guests of honor. You miss the mud? Silas asked, biting lightly at Julian's ear. God no, Julian smirked. But I miss the barn. We can go back next weekend, Silas promised. Check the mash. Scare the locals. Julian turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had saved him, the man he had saved in return. The broken pieces had been put back together, forged with gold, stronger than before. I love you, Julian said. It was still a surprise to say it, even after all this time. I know, Silas grinned, the expression transforming his rugged face. I love you too, city boy. Now let's go show them what we built. And that is how the viper tamed the wolf, and how the wolf gave the viper a heart. If you enjoyed seeing Julian take control when it mattered most, destroy that like button. And tell me in the comments. Would you forgive a family member who tried to ruin you? Or would you destroy them like Julian did? I'll be reading your answers. Subscribe for the next chapter. Until then.